What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video as the New York Giants went out there and added another member to the coaching staff. Did a video yesterday when I talked about that the New York Giants were down to 3 finalists for the offensive coordinator job and that we would get a decision, according to reports, before the end of the week. Well, we got a decision a little bit earlier today. It's now official. The New York Giants have named Mike Kafka to be the offensive coordinator for the New York Giants going into next season. And in this video, we'll dive into him a little bit. Talked about him briefly yesterday, however. I think it's a good hire. I said yesterday Pep Hamilton was my preference. It was down to Hamilton, O'Shea, and Kafka. I would have had Kafka at 2. A very close 2, though. Kafka's definitely nobody to sneeze at. He's been a guy that teams have been really wanting to bring onto their staff for quite some time now, even though that he's only 34 years old. The reason I preferred Pep, well, Pep's been in the league for a little bit longer. He's been an offensive coordinator before, something that Kafka does not bring to the table. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be a bad thing. That could be a great thing. He could be the next great offensive coordinator. There's been teams in the past. The Seattle Seahawks wanted to bring him in a couple of years ago. The Philadelphia Eagles tried to bring him in, I think, for a head coach position, if not certainly for an offensive coordinator position. We'll get to that in a second, but Andy Reid blocked it. And what will Kafka bring to the New York Giants football team? Well, we don't know quite yet who's going to be calling the plays. Of course, Daboll was an offensive coordinator with the Buffalo Bills, and you would think he would have a lot to say in the overall offense that the New York Giants are going to run. Now, Daboll doesn't really have a set scheme, or at least it feels and seems that way. I'm sure it'll be a lot more innovative than the offense we've run in years past, but he's a guy that constantly changes things up on a daily basis and tries to fit the offense around his players. Kafka is coming from Andy Reid. Andy Reid, of course, runs a West Coast style offense, and there's been a number of coaches that have coached under Andy Reid that were quarterback coaches specifically and elevated themselves to become offensive coordinators and, soon thereafter head coaches. One of them being Pat Shurmur. Pat Shurmur started under Andy Reid before he became a head coach with the Cleveland Browns, then ultimately ending up with the New York Giants. And we all know that Pat Shurmur was not a great head coach, but he was actually a pretty good offensive coordinator. That's why he got promoted the way in which he did. Matt Nagy being another one, along with Doug Peterson, who, of course, won a Super Bowl. So there have been some coaches that have had some success under Andy Reid that have transferred to other places. I would think that they try to institute at least the Andy Reid offense partially into this offense, especially if they stick with Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones, after all, was drafted to fit Pat Shurmur's scheme. You would think Shurmur and Kafka probably at least have a similar playbook. Obviously, it's not going to be identical, but it would be a similar offense that Daniel Jones was initially drafted for. So I think it's an ideal fit for our current quarterback if Daniel Jones is going to be the quarterback going forward. But like I said, we don't know whether or not Kafka is going to be calling the plays, Daboll's going to be calling the plays, what type of offense they're ultimately going to run. I think it'll be a collaboration, but regardless, I think this is a very interesting hire by the New York Giants. But let's go over Kafka's resume. It's not very long. The other thing I'll say is he actually played for Andy Reid, which you would even further make you believe that, he's going to try to bring that type of offense over to the New York Giants. As a head coach, or not a head coach, as a coach, started at Northwestern as a graduate assistant, which is actually where he played college football. Then in 2017, came over to the Kansas City Chiefs as an offensive quality control coach. You'll notice that's the same year that the Kansas City Chiefs drafted Pat Mahomes. He's been there since Pat Mahomes has been there. It's why he's been a hot candidate in recent years to potentially become an offensive coordinator somewhere else. And several reports in recent years have said that the Chiefs were actually molding him to be the new offensive coordinator, assuming that Eric Bieniemy was going to get a head coaching job sooner than later. Bieniemy has not gotten that head coaching job yet, so Kafka now will have to move on and he'll end up with the New York Giants. After he was an offensive quality control coach, he got promoted to a quarterbacks coach from 2018 to 2019. I brought up a quote in my video yesterday in which Pat Mahomes talked about how good of a job Kafka did with him as a coach of the football team, expressed the fundamentals, was always riding him to improve as a quarterback. In 2018 was actually the first year, even though he was drafted in 17, that Pat Mahomes became the full-time starter for the Kansas City Chiefs. Then in 2020, he got a promotion. He became the QB coach and the passing game coordinator over the last 2 years. Of course, Pat Mahomes has a lot to do with the success of both Andy Reid and Kafka, but you have to at least give Kafka some credit. Pat Mahomes, at the end of the day, was thought to be a project coming into the NFL, much like a guy like Josh Allen, who has flourished since entering the league under Andy Reid. This, just a headline that I wanted to pull up for you guys in terms of who's going to be calling the plays. Schoen came out about a week ago when asked about this, and Giants Joe Schoen would prefer Brian Daboll not call the plays. And if that's the case, I'm going to assume that Kafka is going to be the play caller, but you have to think that Brian Daboll is going to have a lot of input in terms of the type of offense they run and the overall game plan, much like I think Joe Judge did with Jason Garrett. But expect Kafka to be the guy that's calling plays for the New York Giants in 2022, or at least that's my expectations at this point in time. And I don't think he would have taken this job had he not thought he was going to get the call the plays. After all, Kafka was very much in demand. If you go back to 2020, like I said earlier, this was a report coming out from CBS Sports. Chiefs Andy Reid keeps the Eagles from poaching Mike Kafka as an offensive coordinator per report, meaning the Eagles were going to take him from him, but Reid stepped in. He said, no, you're not going to do that. Now, I think you have two opportunities to be able to block teams from doing that. He exercised that against the Philadelphia Eagles in 2020. So he's been in high demand for quite some time, and I don't think Kafka would have taken this job if he didn't feel like he was going to have a huge input in terms of the overall offensive game plan in a week-in, week-out basis. And that's all I got for you guys, actually. That was the Shea Tierney thing. It's going to be a quicker video today. I went over him briefly yesterday. Listen, what he's going to bring to this offense, like I said, is going to be a West Coast-style offense, much like the Andy Reid system. And I expect to see this offense next year be much more innovative. Between Daboll and Kafka, it's going to be a fun team to watch next year for the New York Giants. And you have to hope that they're going to vastly improve from the product we had last year. Of course, we were 32nd overall. We don't know what the team's going to look like. We still may add some pieces in the draft and in free agency. Who knows? We may draft a quarterback, even though I personally think we'll be sticking with Daniel Jones. But regardless, whoever the quarterback is going to be, I think they're going to be in much better hands. And you know, I've seen people on Twitter saying, oh, they're bringing in Kafka, they're bringing all these pieces to try to give Daniel Jones the perfect situation. That's not the way I look at it as a fan. Yes, it's absolutely possible that Daniel Jones may be the quarterback going into next year, but I don't think the New York Giants are just thinking about next year. They're trying to set up the perfect situation for whoever the quarterback may be here long term, so they don't fail the new quarterback if they move on from Jones the same way that they started off with Daniel Jones over the first 4 years while he was with the New York Giants. So that's the way I look at it, and hopefully Kafka will be a long-term piece. There's no telling what will ultimately happen if this offense turns around quickly. You have to figure that he may go on and potentially get a head coaching job sooner than later, being that those types of coaches are in high demand, much like the New York Giants did with Brian Daboll. The good news is for the Giants, we have a good offensive mind at the top, so they can go out there and bring in a new offensive play caller. But I'm excited to see what Kafka could bring to the table for the New York Giants. And I definitely think he fits Daniel Jones' skill set rather well, much like I thought Pat Shurmur did. As always, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.